Stanford University.
Welcome to EE 380. Stanford is a research institution for higher learning for which the facts of the matter dominate taboos and opinions. Considering the facts, it is my opinion that without Alan Turing, Stanford University, Silicon Valley, and the world would be a very different place. The advance of our species in the past 200 years of the Industrial Revolution is marked by our increasing mastery of machines and the enslavement of the population to its cause. Inspired by the mechanism of perforated cards invented by Joseph Jacquard and the later work of Charles Babbage and Ada Lovelace, Alan Turing formalized the concept of the universal machine and enabled the development of modern computing machinery. In the lost war against tyranny, Turing gave his life selflessly to an ungrateful and intolerant society. He cracked the Enigma code that enabled the British Isles to overcome the German U-boat blockade that held Britain hostage. His contribution shortened the war against Hitler and helped to ensure its victory. It is difficult to consider Alan Turing's contributions without taking these broader matters into account. Turing was the first computational biologist, the father of what would later become artificial intelligence, and he was a modern philosopher of the mind. We are left to wonder what he would have made of what followed had he lived. We are privileged today to have with us Jack Copeland, one of the world's leading Turing scholars. Jack is shortly on his way to England, where I shall join him with others in June to participate in the International Alan Turing celebrations. Jack is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge, New Zealand. He is currently the Royden B. Davis Chair of Interdisciplinary Studies in the Department of Psychology at Georgetown University. I'd like to welcome Jack Copeland.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you all for watching, those of you who aren't here. I hope you're going to enjoy it. This is the talk of the book of which this is the cover, and the book will be out very soon, I hope. I haven't quite finished it yet, but I nevertheless hope it will be out very soon. The publishers were expecting it at the end of last month, but I fear they've been disappointed, but it shouldn't be long now. I blame the irresistible attractions of Georgetown, which is the most vibrant and exciting place I've ever lived in, I guess. But anyway, the book is on its way, honest. So let me show you a couple of pictures of Turing to get things going. There aren't many photographs of Turing in existence, and I'm grateful to the Turing family for permission to show these two this afternoon. He was not really much photographed during his life, a few stray snapshots, and then 6 to 8 photographs all taken in the same photographic session, the one in which this was taken and the previous one that I just showed. That one photographic session, which was probably for a passport, is our best visual record of Alan Turing, in fact. So Turing was a shy genius studying mathematics at King's College, Cambridge. And in 1936, in his very early 20s, he completely unexpectedly invented the fundamental principle of the modern computer. Turing was working on an abstract problem in the foundations of mathematics, Hilbert's decision problem. No one could have guessed that such abstruse, arcane work could have led to anything of any practical value whatsoever, let alone to a machine that would change all our lives. But it did. As everyone who can operate a PC knows, the way to get the machine to do the job you want, word processing, say, is to find the appropriate program in memory and click on it. That was Turing's invention, the so-called stored program concept. That was the crucial insight that he had in 1936. This was all on paper, of course. There was no actual engineering in those days. That would come later. Turing showed, though, that by inserting different programs in memory, what he called his universal Turing machine could be made to carry out any task for which a program could be written. His fabulous idea really was for a single machine, a single slab of hardware, that by making use of coded instructions stored in its memory could change itself, chameleon-like, from a machine dedicated to one particular task into a machine dedicated to a completely different task, from word processor to calculator to chess opponent, say. There was no need to change the wiring. You just type the instructions straight in on the tape. I guess nowadays, when almost everyone owns a physical realization of a universal Turing machine, Turing's idea of a one-stop shop computing machine is liable to seem as obvious as the wheel or the arch. But in 1936, when engineers thought in terms of building different machines for different tasks, Turing's idea of a single machine that could see off all information processing tasks was revolutionary, startling. It wasn't until after the Second World War that Turing began to actually construct a universal Turing machine. And it was here at Bletchley Park that Turing first learned of the technology that he would need in order to implement his world-changing idea, the universal stored program computer. And electronics was the way to do it, as he learnt while he was breaking codes at this British country house, where he took up residence on the first full day of the war in 1939. Neville Chamberlain declared war around midday on Germany one day, and the next day Turing showed up at Bletchley Park. And at that time he had, of course, a lot more on his mind than just the universal Turing machine. He was working on the German Enigma codes and had been working on them for several months before war broke out. There were various flavors of Enigma, of course. Air Force Enigma, Naval Enigma, Army Enigma, Railway Enigma, SS Enigma. They all had their different ways of using what was fundamentally the same machine. And during 1940, the first full year of the war, the flavor of Enigma used by the German Air Force was being read in large quantities at Bletchley Park, which contributed greatly to the air battles. For example, decrypted Enigma messages gave away the nightly targets of the bombers during the Blitz. Because the bombers were targeted by beams, they flew to the confluence of two beams. And Enigma messages would be sent out to the beam aiming stations on mainland Europe, telling them what angles to point their beams at that night. Bletchley Park was reading those messages, and so the RAF knew where the bombers were heading and were able to blast the enemy planes out of the sky. Turing played an early role in breaking Air Force Enigma. He broke a version of Air Force Enigma that they called Blue at Bletchley Park. They began by using the colors to name the various Enigma keys, blue, green, yellow, red, and so on. They pretty soon ran out of colors, and by the end of the war there were thousands of keys, and they went through names of flowers and names of fish and practically every systematic naming system that exists in our languages. But that was Air Force Enigma. The much more secure form of Enigma that was used by the North Atlantic German U-boats remained unbroken. So let me take you back to those dark days in 1940 and 1941 when Turing and his colleagues in his unit, which was known simply as Hut 8, were pitted against U-boat Enigma. The basic situation was simple. All the materials that Britain needed in order to prosecute the war came from this country. And the materials were carried across the North Atlantic in giant convoys, 60, 80, maybe even more vessels sailing at once, with a few Navy escort vessels. And the convoys were preyed on by the North Atlantic U-boats, and the North Atlantic U-boats were so successful that by the middle of 1941, Britain was in acute danger of being simply starved into surrender. Everything was coming across that North Atlantic lifeline: munitions, petrol, food, and the U-boats were sending large quantities of it to the bottom of the sea. And in fact, Churchill's advisors told him in June 1941 that Britain could only hold out for a few more months. There just weren't enough stores of essential materials to prosecute the war for any longer. But if, on the other hand, U-boat Enigma could be broken, then the messages from the U-boats to their bases in Europe would reveal their positions. And so the convoys could very easily be routed round the U-boats. The U-boats would be unable to follow them in the North Atlantic wastes, just so long as the convoys knew the positions of the U-boats. So that was Turing's problem. And it was in June 1941, that same month that Churchill heard from his advisors that the end was nigh, it was in June 1941 that Turing first broke into the daily U-boat messages. He'd been working on the problem since September 1939, so that's about 20 months to crack U-boat Enigma. So I guess that's some kind of measure of how difficult that particular code was to crack. The intelligence that Turing and his colleagues in Hut 8 were able to supply to the Admiralty had an immediate effect on the North Atlantic position. The convoy reroutings that were made on the basis of Turing's intelligence were so successful that during the first 23 days of June, not a single convoy was sighted by the U-boats. I think that's a remarkable statistic. No sightings for 23 days. You would think that the Germans would immediately suspect that their codes were being read. How else could this sudden change be explained? But no, it seems they didn't suspect. And Bletchley Park and British intelligence went to extreme lengths in order to conceal the fact that the code breakers had managed to get into U-boat Enigma. British intelligence kind of distributed a fairy story via German prisoners and allowed the prisoners to write letters home about this fairy story and so on. There were various mechanisms. But the essence of the fairy story was that a super radar had been invented, a particularly powerful version of radar that could detect enemy submarines hundreds of miles away, even when they were submerged below the surface. It was a complete cock and bull story, of course, but nevertheless the cover-up was very successful. Turing was assisted in his battle against U-boat Enigma by the Royal Navy, who were able to capture Enigma materials from German vessels. And this is one such vessel. It's the U-110, which was shadowing a convoy south of Iceland for several days. And then around midday one day, the U-110, while submerged, launched off 2 torpedoes in quick succession, and within minutes of each other, sank 2 merchant vessels. The Navy, in particular the British corvette Aubritia, were able to get a fix on the position of the U-110 by what they called ASDIC in those days and what we now call sonar. And the Aubritia steamed to the position where the U-110 was believed to be and dropped 10 depth charges overhead. And the effect of these depth charges was to blow the U-110 to the surface. It was a very unusual situation, of course. Normally, when you successfully depth charged a U-boat, then it would sink without trace. And I've heard what the naval officer who led the subsequent boarding party from Aubritia onto the U-110, he said it was the dream of every young naval officer to see a U-boat blown to the surface during a successful depth charge raid. This is the most dramatic picture I've found in connection with the battle against Enigma. I found it completely by accident in the archives of the Imperial War Museum in London. I was looking for something completely different, and I opened an envelope, and inside was this, and there were enough notes to enable me to figure out what it was. It's the survivors from the U-110, the German survivors, who, as soon as the ship burst to the surface, threw themselves into the water to save themselves. They expected the ship to go down any moment, of course. And also, according to the official British report, they were hastened on their way by small arms fire. And anyway, here they are, floating in the middle of the Atlantic, just south of Iceland, and just a few minutes before they were hauled on board a breacher to be given steaming mugs of hot British tea, possibly laced with rum toddies. I don't know what they would have done in those days. But the German sailors were treated very well, captured German sailors. There were many instances where there are, diaries or, wartime accounts that survive and explain how German sailors were treated well. And German materials, diaries of captured sailors and so on, expressed great surprise that they were treated so well. Their belief was that they would most likely be shot if they were captured, but instead they were welcomed and given blankets and so on. I read one diary, which I found rather chilling. This was from a captured German officer, and he'd gone through this treatment, and he said, "I wonder how it would have been had the boot been on the other foot." He said it in German, of course, but that's what he said. I found that an interesting thought. But anyway, a boarding party from the Orbreacher quickly went on board the U-110, and they found an Enigma machine still plugged in. They'd been in the middle of sending a message when they were depth charged. So Sub-Lieutenant David Baum and his boys grabbed the Enigma machine, grabbed any other code books that they could find, and they carried it all back to the Orbreacher, together with various other items of booty. There were German charts of German minefields and all sorts of highly useful bits and pieces. The captain of the U-110, Julius Lemp, was under the strictest of instructions to destroy all Enigma materials if the ship was in danger of being boarded. And he didn't. He just left it all there. He must have been very certain that his U-boat was going to go down within seconds. The thought in his mind must simply have been to get his men off into the sea, and then the ship would be going down straight away. But it worked out quite differently. And so the Enigma materials were, of course, carried back to Bletchley Park. So this is May 1941, just a few weeks before Turing broke into the Uboat Enigma. This machine, the Bombe, was of great help to Turing in breaking Uboat Enigma and eventually in breaking all the flavors of Enigma. Turing invented the Bombe in the autumn of 1939, and then the first prototype version, which they called simply Victory, was delivered to Bletchley Park in the spring of 1940. And initially, this one bomb was reserved for use by Turing and his colleagues in Hut 8 for their attack on naval Enigma. The bomb was about 7 feet high. You may just be able to make out some interesting features on this picture. There are some swastikas up here on the top bar that someone has doodled on. And there's a notice here that you can just about make out, a handwritten notice which says, "Keep feet off." The bomb searched for the crucial settings of the Enigma machine. Before the Enigma operator sent a message, they would set the machine up in various ways. There were various things they could do, change positions in a plug board and change the positions of wheels and so on. In order to break a message, the code breakers needed to know how the operator had set the machine up at the beginning of the message. And that was the information that the bomb would reveal. It searched through possible Enigma settings. Each of these cylinders mimicked one of the 3 wheels of the Enigma machine. And so when the bomb was switched on, these cylinders span rapidly for a while, and then the bomb would suddenly stop. And when it stopped, its guess at the message start positions of the Enigma's 3 wheels were on these 3 drums here, the so-called indicator drums. The Enigma machine had 3 wheels. Before the operator sent a particular message, the wheels would be put into a particular position, and the bomb could search for and guess at what the positions of those 3 wheels were. And when the bomb stopped, those positions would appear here on these 3 indicator drums. The Enigma also had a plug board which the operator could manipulate, change the settings of the plugs. The plug board, the Bombe's guess at the plug board settings could be read off from other relay equipment here on the side of the machine that you can't really see in the picture. The Bombe didn't always get it right. When it stopped, they would test those settings either on an Enigma machine or a replica Enigma machine. They do it by hand, and if the machine managed to turn the coded message into German, all was well. If it didn't, then they pressed the start button on the Bombe again and searched some more. The Bombe didn't search exhaustively. That would have taken far too long to search through all the possible positions of the Enigma machine. That just couldn't be done in useful amounts of time. The setting space was too large. It's like chess. You've probably all heard the thing about if a computer were programmed to play chess by exhaustive search, by examining all the possible moves that were available, then it would take thousands of millions of years to play a game right out. No hope in playing chess that way. And it's exactly the same with Enigma. An exhaustive search would have taken too long to have been useful. The war would have already been concluded before the machine, before the Bombe broke its first message. So what the Bombe did was speed things up by using heuristic search. I was astonished and extremely pleased when I first discovered that the Bombe used heuristic search. I found this out quite by accident again as a result of reading declassified documents about how the Bombe worked, in particular Turing's explanations of how the Bombe worked, and there he is saying that the Bombe used heuristic search. He doesn't use those words, they were invented later of course, but there was the concept. And as far as I know, Turing's Bombe was the first manifestation of what we now call heuristic search. The next few slides are just for people who don't know what heuristics are. I'm sure probably everyone in this room knows very well what heuristics are, but just in case. A heuristic is a rule that cuts down the amount of searching required, and a heuristic is not necessarily guaranteed to produce the correct solution, but it works often enough to be useful. The Bombe didn't always manage to break a message, but it would break enough messages in order to be useful. The Bombe's heuristics did not always work. So for example, one heuristic that everyone uses from time to time is if you've lost something, search in the vicinity of the place where you think you dropped it. So if you lose your keys could be anywhere in the universe, but you can speed up the search by starting to look at the place where you thought you might have dropped them. This heuristic won't always work, but it works often enough to be useful. Exactly the same with the Bombe. Yeah. Sorry?
Unless you search onto the lamp post. Not very wide.
So, once Turing, via the Bombe, had glimpsed the possibility of achieving machine intelligence by means of heuristic search, he was hooked. That was it for the rest of his life. His code-breaking colleagues at Bletchley Park can remember him in his spare time. You know, after a hard day's code breaking, this is how Turing would entertain himself in the evenings. He'd think about his new idea of heuristic problem solving. And his colleagues can remember him circulating a typescript at Bletchley Park concerning machine intelligence and the possibilities of heuristic search. This paper is now lost, unfortunately, but it was undoubtedly the first paper in the field of artificial intelligence. Not, of course, that the name artificial intelligence was around at that time. That didn't arrive until 1956, more than a decade later, in Dartmouth College with the Shannon McCarthy Summer Research Project on Artificial Intelligence. Turing's earlier name was machine intelligence, and it was machine intelligence that he was investigating at Bletchley Park. And as I view the story, the Bombe, Turing's Bombe, was the first milestone on the road to modern AI.
I think one point actually, if you could tell them roughly how many Enigma machines were made and how many Turing bombs as well as Colossi. These were not onesie-twosies. These were massive numbers of machines.
They were not onesie-twosies. You mentioned Colossus. I'll get on to that later. Bombs, by the end of the war at Bletchley Park and in the outstations around Bletchley Park, they had just over 200 Turing bombs operating. And there were a further, I believe, 140 bombs in this country, basically Turing bombs, but changed up a bit by a brilliant engineer by the name of Desch, who worked at Dayton, Ohio. And he designed an electronic version of Turing's bomb. There were electronic versions of Turing's bomb designed by Brits as well. There were various different types. But Desch's electronic bombs were just far superior to any of the electronic bombs they built in Britain. Much more reliable, much faster. Turing's original bomb was not electronic, and it was good as long as the Enigma machines only had 3 wheels. But towards the end, well, later in the war, a 4th wheel was added to the Enigma machine, which increased the search space considerably, and you really needed electronic speeds in order to search through that larger space. So that was the drive to build electronic bombs. Well, could I just say, the Washington bombs, they were largely controlled by Bletchley Park. They had such good telecommunications between Bletchley Park and this country that I've heard one of the Bletchley Park guys saying this. They were able to use the Washington bombs as easily as if they'd been in an outstation just a few miles down the road from Bletchley Park, which I think is quite remarkable. Sorry.
So in the machine you showed, there was another set of 3 wheels on the top and something on the bottom. You only talked about the middle part. Was that another machine? Was that 3?
No, that was all one bomb.
Yeah.
The bomb had lots of cylinders. They were all mimicking the 3 wheels of the one Enigma machine, but you know, at different positions and with different this and that.
And did the Germans this? Is that why they added the 4th wheel? Or?
Probably not. The evidence is not clear on this point, but probably not.
What about the coordination between those 200 and, say, the US?
Well, the way of operating would be that you needed a crib in order for the bomb to run. A crib was a cryptographer's guess at part of the message, maybe a standard opening or maybe Heil Hitler at the end or something like that. So they guessed that there were these words somewhere in the message, and then you would wire the bomb up to search for that particular crib to find a way of transforming the ciphertext into the letters of the German crib. If you could do that, then you'd got the right settings. So
you don't want all the machines to search with the same initial conditions.
That's right. So there was a complex organisation for kind of farming out the cribs to different bomb groups, and also for sending cribs over the Atlantic for the US bombs to search for. Turing said at one point, when he was visiting Desch's outfit in Dayton, he said the principle that the American bombs will use British-made cribs is now settled on. And that was how it worked for a while. Towards, in the later stages of the war, from kind of mid-1944 on, Washington was kind of up to speed in the business of finding cribs, which was a difficult art. And they kind of took over, particularly for the Shark U-boat link. They took over the business of cribbing from Bletchley Park. But until that point, it was all, everything was done from Bletchley Park and just kind of mechanically farmed out to the various bomb units, in particular over here. Yeah?
Were used in parallel. It was an instance of kind of early parallel computing, really, that you split up the search space based on different initial guesses for the same message.
No, not really. They'd have one bomb per crib. They'd got lots of computing units, that's for sure. So it's kind of parallel in some sense. But and they might sometimes have been running several cribs on several bombs, but usually it was one crib per bomb. They had so many messages to break that unless they had a message that was particularly crucial, it's unlikely that they would assign more than one bomb to it. They were breaking, by the middle of 1943, they were breaking 2 Enigma messages every minute at Bletchley Park. So that gives you some idea of the volume. So they wouldn't really want to be, giving, several of their limited number of bombs to the same message. They just want to keep the throughput rolling.
The more multiprocessing.
I take it that each bomb was doing parallel processing. And
Oh, yes.
all these copies of the 3 wheels.
Yes, yes. So there we are, artificial intelligence. But that's kind of before I stop talking about that, let me say that in 1948, 3 years after the war ended, of course, Turing wrote the first manifesto of artificial intelligence. He called it simply intelligent machinery. So this is 8 years before the Shannon-McCarthy conference at Dartmouth. And in Intelligent Machinery, Turing brilliantly introduced a number of the core concepts of artificial intelligence, some of which were subsequently reinvented by other people. For example, there was the idea of a genetic algorithm, that's there in Turing's 1948 report. There's the idea of logical search. There's the idea of a form of connectionist learning. Sadly, though, Turing never published the 1948 report, probably because his employer at that time was devastatingly rude about Turing's report. This guy, he knew nothing about artificial intelligence. He was running an industrial research unit. The idea that Turing should be wasting his time on this stuff was just anathema to this guy. And he dismissed it as a schoolboy's essay. And I guess, faced with such negativity, Turing just tucked it away in his bottom drawer, and that was it. The world never saw it. Although 2 years later, yep.
What are you talking about? His employer?
Turing's employer.
Yeah.
Yeah, Darwin. Charles Darwin, grandson of the real Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin lived in the shadow of his grandfather, the real Charles Darwin.
Oh dear.
And he ran a research laboratory in London called the National Physical Laboratory, which Turing joined after the war. And that's where Turing built his first computer, as I'll go on to explain. Or at any rate, designed it. Other people built it. So that was 1948. And then in 1950, of course, Turing did publish a paper on artificial intelligence, his famous paper in the philosophy journal Mind, Computing, Machinery and Intelligence, which everyone knows about nowadays, and everyone knows about the Turing Test, as we call it, which is incorporated in that paper. So the idea of Turing's test is that a judge has to, by question and answer, decide which of the 2 contestants is the human being and which one is the computer. And the computer, Turing says, is allowed to perform any tricks in order to evade identification. So sensible moves for the computer would be to say no in response to the question, are you a computer? The computer is allowed to lie. And for example, if the computer is asked to multiply 2 huge numbers together, then the computer should pause for a considerable time and then produce a wrong answer. Turing said that if a computer passed the Turing test, i.e. managed to evade identification, then he said that some people might say that that shows the computer is thinking. He said that it seems better to avoid begging the question, and he would call a machine that passed a grade A machine. And he said the question of whether computers can pass the Turing test is not quite the same, he says, as whether computers can think, but it seems near enough for our purposes, he said. Turing is widely reported in the secondary literature as having predicted that the Turing test would be passed by the end of last century. And he's got some stick, since his prediction, as people have been saying, turned out to be false. But I don't think that's fair at all, because that isn't what he predicted. He actually predicted something quite different. This is what he said in a conversation with his friend Max Newman in 1952. Newman said, "I should like to be there when your match between a man and a machine takes place, and perhaps to try my hand at making up some of the questions. But that will be a long time from now if the machine is to stand any chance with no questions barred. And Turing says, oh yes, at least 100 years, I should say. So that prediction has got 40 years still to run. But this is to get well ahead of the code-breaking story. As a code breaker, Turing's next task was to break the so-called tunny machine, the machine that kind of came along after Enigma. It was in many ways more important than Enigma. People sometimes call it Hitler's BlackBerry. It was a machine designed by the scientists of the Third Reich, specifically for use by the German military. And here it is, once inside its case and once outside. So on the right-hand side, you can see the wheels of the machine. As with Enigma, the tunny's wheels were the heart of the action. And there they are, 12 of them standing side by side like plates in a dish rack. The Enigma, as I said, had 3 wheels, and then later versions had 4 wheels. So that gives you an idea of the additional complexity that there was in the tunny machine, 12 wheels.
Do you know have any idea how many of these were manufactured?
Oh, lots. Exact numbers I don't know, but thousands. Many were captured after the war as the Russian armies swept across Europe.
Norman Polmar, 200,000 Enigmas were made. So
yes, I would say that's plausible.
yeah, so a few thousand of these.
Yeah, several thousand. I'm not sure that it would be possible to find out exactly now. But there were about 30 to 35 tunny radio links across Europe when the network was at its height. And they'd have probably 4 tunnies at each end of those links. And then there were large fixed exchanges in various places, Berlin, Königsberg for the eastern links through Russia, Paris, and so on. So there would have been, kind of more tunnies at those places. So you can form a rough estimate of how many there would have been from the number of links that there were. Tunny was much more sophisticated than Enigma. Enigma was old technology by the time war broke out. It was marketed commercially in the early 1920s, and the German military added a few bells and whistles to it during the 30s, increased its security. But it was no longer cutting-edge technology by 1939. It was slow and it was clumsy to use. It required the remarkably large number of 6 people to encipher, send, and decrypt a single message. You needed 3 people at each end of the radio link. There'd be the cipher clerk who would type the German message in plain German at the keyboard of the Enigma machine. And then each time the cipher clerk pressed a key, a different letter would light up in the so-called lamp board of the Enigma machine, which was an arrangement of 26 torch bulbs, each one of which had a stenciled letter pasted over it. So as the cipher clerk typed the plain text at the keyboard, successive letters would light up at the lamp board. They were the letters of the ciphertext. And the clerk's assistant painstakingly noted those letters down as they lit up. And then once the message was completely enciphered, the assistant would pass the sheet of paper with the ciphertext on to the third player, the radio operator, who would then convert the ciphertext into Morse code and transmit it to the other end of the link. And then at the far end of the link, you needed another 3 operators in order to reverse the whole process. With tunny, you only needed 1 operator at the end of each link. The tunny machine was attached to a teleprinter keyboard. The single operator at the sending link typed the plain text at the keyboard, and from then on, everything was automatic. The tunny enciphered the message automatically. Morse code wasn't used at all. The encrypted output of the tunny machine went directly to air. And then at the receiving end, everything was automatic also. Under normal operating conditions, neither the sending operator nor the receiving operator would ever even see the ciphertext. As far as they were concerned, it was just plain German that went in and plain German that came out. So how did it work? Well, the 12 wheels of the Turing machine were divided into two groups of 5, and then another group of 2, the so-called motor wheels sitting in the middle there. And then there were the psi wheels, as they were called at Bletchley Park, on the left, and then the 5 chi wheels on the right. The motor wheels had a fairly humdrum function. They just determined whether other code wheels would move or not. It was the chi wheels and the psi wheels that did the main business. And the way Turing worked was essentially to take the plain text and encrypt it by adding to it 2 successive layers of encryption, adding 2 layers of obscuring letters to produce the ciphertext. So if the German operator typed P, for example, then the teleprinter keyboard would produce a stream of 1s and 0s, the teleprint code for the letter P. Teleprint code always came in bunches of 5. The teleprint code for the letter P would be some combination of 5, 0s and 1s and so on for all the other keyboard characters. So the pulses and no pulses from the P would flow into the adder, and then the chi wheels would produce the first obscuring letter, M, say. The reason there are 5 chi wheels was because one wheel produced each bit in the teleprint encryption of the letter. So 5 bits, so you needed 5 wheels. So the M was added to P to produce R. Then R went into the second adder, and the second obscuring letter from the psi wheels was added to it. Addition was just exclusive disjunction, essentially. And so the first letter of ciphertext would pop out of the adder, and that would go down the link by radio, and so on for the rest of the ciphertext letters that were generated. The Allies knew virtually nothing about how Turing worked. They could tell that it was a teleprint code, but no Turing machines had been captured. As we saw, Enigma machines were captured, so how they worked could be determined by the engineers simply by taking the machines apart. But no Turing machines were captured until the end of the war, in fact. But amazingly, this man, Bill Tutt, managed to figure out the entire logical structure of the Turing machine without ever having set his eyes on one. And even more amazingly, he managed to do this from just 2 intercepted messages, each about 4,000 characters long. So he reverse engineered the Turing machine on the basis of just 2 measly intercepts. It was the most remarkable feat of cryptanalysis during the whole of the Second World War, perhaps ever. I don't know. We don't really know what they've done since, but Tuts break must be up there.
That depended on the 2 messages being almost identical and also using the same code, which was not
They were a depth. Yes, they were a depth. But there were plenty of depths around at that time. The Germans hadn't really wised up to how dangerous depths were. They dried up later, but they made horrendous errors during the first months of Turing. There were loads of depths. And also, they sent the 12 wheel settings unencrypted. Can you believe it? They just used names. So there were, Anton was the A position of the first wheel, and Bertha was the B position of the second wheel, and so on. So each Turing message was just preceded by a string of names, Gustav, Dora, etc. It was a complete gift. They stopped that after about 10 months. Presumably they realized how stupid it was, but by then the damage was done and the British were well into Turing. So that's what Tutt did. His was the first break-in. He reverse engineered the machine. Tutt was a humble, quiet kind of guy, and he's never really got his dues. People don't know much about Bill Tutt. Even people who worked on Turing at Bletchley Park, who were actually breaking the messages thanks to what Tutt did, even they were not told that it was Tutt who'd broken the machine. Because of the need-to-know principle, they didn't need to know who'd broken the machine, and so they weren't told. And so Tutt kind of lapsed into obscurity. It's one of the saddest stories of the Bletchley Park operation, I think. But there are 2 things that you need to do in order to get into a new cipher system. Break the machine, which Tutt had done, but just knowing the structure of the machine isn't enough to enable you to read the daily messages. To do that, you need to know the settings of the machine that the operator used when he transmitted the message. So that second step remained to be done. And it was Turing who took that second step. I think this isn't, even today, this isn't terribly well known because the tunny materials remained classified for a long time. And it wasn't until 2000 that GCHQ finally let them go. And the general report on tunny contained details of Turing's break into tunny. So what Turing did was devised the first systematic method for breaking into the daily tunny traffic. And it was based on a process that he invented that he called deltaing. I guess it's called differencing nowadays. Deltaing is kind of a process of sideways addition. So if you have a stream consisting of 4 letters, A, B, C, D, then to delta those 4 characters, you add A to B, B to C, and C to D to produce 3 characters. Those 3 characters are the delta of the original 4 characters. That was Turing's invention. You could be forgiven for thinking that this process of sideways addition would just make things worse. Surely doing that to the encoded message would just scramble it still further. But remarkably, Turing was able to show that deltaing, in fact, would reveal information that was otherwise hidden. And that was his route in to breaking the tunny messages. Turing's method wasn't carried out by machine. His method, which in the laconic jargon of Bletchley Park was called simply Turingery, his method was carried out by the code breakers using paper and pencil. They attacked each individual message by Turingery using paper and pencil. Built Up wasn't too impressed by that. There was obviously some rivalry between Tutt and Turing. Tutt said that Turing's method, when you're applying Turing's method, you need to make use of what you felt in your bones. And Tutt described Turing's method as more artistic than mathematical. Tutt wanted a purely mathematical method that could be implemented in a machine, that would make no use of human insight, no use of what you felt in your bones, something that was cut and dried enough to be implemented in a machine. And by making some brilliant extensions of Turing's notion of deltaing, Tutt was able to come up with such a method in the middle of 1942. But there was a snag. Tutt's method required huge amounts of low-grade calculation, so much low-grade calculation that if his method was carried out on paper and pencil, as Turingery was, then it would take hundreds, maybe even thousands of years for a human code breaker to break a single message using Tutt's method. It was a bit of an obstacle. But one day Tutt was, in his shy, quiet way, he was explaining his method to this man, Max Newman, who we met earlier in that dialogue with Turing. Newman was one of Turing's teachers at Cambridge before the war. It was in one of Newman's lectures, by Newman's account anyway, that he first gave Turing the idea that led Turing to the universal Turing machine. And then in 1942, Newman left Cambridge, joined Bletchley Park, and threw his considerable energies into the attack on tunny. As soon as Tutt had explained his method, Newman said, let's use electronic counters in order to do the arithmetic. It was a brilliant idea. Newman had seen electronic counters at work before the war in the Cavendish laboratory in Cambridge, where they were using them to count radioactive emissions. And in a flash of insight, he saw that this technology could be transferred to the completely different problem of cracking tunny. Newman was put in charge of building an appropriate machine, and a few months later it was installed at Bletchley Park. It was soon called the Heath Robinson. Heath Robinson was in those days, famous British cartoonist who drew overly ingenious contrivances. I guess Rube Goldberg would be the nearest equivalent in this country. The Heath Robinson, as soon as it was switched on, smoke rose, and the engineers had to dive in and cool things down. I don't actually have a picture of Heath Robinson. I don't believe that any photograph of it survives. This is a machine, it was the successor machine to Heath Robinson. They came to call it in the end Old Robinson. Heath Robinson was the prototype, and this machine was a sort of smoothed over version. I gather they looked very similar, except that Old Robinson is not quite as rough and ready. And Old Robinson, as you can see, has machined aluminium wheels, for example, whereas the original... it did still smoke, though. The tapes would get very hot, the spinning tapes. And the original Heath Robinson had wooden wheels instead of the machined aluminium wheels. This tape that you can see, this contained the tunny message that they were going to attack, punched into the tape in teleprint code. Heath Robinson was never really a great success, but it did work well enough in order to prove that Turing's deltaing could be done by machine and Tuts Method could be done by machine. But the Robinsons only contained a handful of vacuum tubes, a handful of electronic valves, and they were mostly based on relays, which you probably know about, which were kind of pre-electronic technology. Relays are electrically driven switches. There is a moving metal rod which opens and closes an electrical circuit. Relays are clunky, they're large, they operate slowly, they're unreliable because as the rod moves it generates wear. And they're slow, most of all they're slow. For the attack on tunny, something better than relays was required. The original bombs were built out of relays, and for Enigma that was fine, but it just wasn't fast enough for Tuts Method against tunny. So enter Tom Flowers, the brilliant electronic engineer who gave the Bletchley Park codebreakers the world's first large-scale electronic computer. Flowers had been working with vacuum tubes, or electronic valves as he would have called them, the British term. He'd been working with them since the early 1930s, and he knew their capabilities inside out. I guess valves or vacuum tubes are such ancient technology that it's perfectly possible that some people in this room will never have seen one. So I thought I should bring along some photographs of some of the valves that Flowers actually used in his computer, Colossus. So there are 4 of them. And the one on the right is not a valve at all, but a photoelectric cell that they used to read the holes in the punched tape. Flowers was a telephone engineer. He'd been working for the British Post Office, who ran the country's telephone system since the late 1920s. And fairly early in the 1930s, he had begun to build massive installations of valves that were to be used in telephone exchanges to control the connections between the exchanges, London and Liverpool, say. And Flowers built these installations consisting of 3,000 to 4,000 electronic valves, which for those days was enormous, unthinkable, unheard of, because the belief at that time was that electronic valves were just too unreliable to be used in large installations. Electronic valves contained a hot glowing filament which generated the stream of electrons, and those filaments were very fragile. So they could easily lead to the sudden death of a valve. So if you were just using couple of dozen valves, that would be reliable. But if you had several hundreds or several thousands of valves in one installation, then it was only going to be a short while before another valve blew and the whole installation would go offline. So that was the belief amongst engineers at the time. You just couldn't build large installations of valves. They would not be sufficiently reliable. But Flowers knew better. Flowers had discovered that as long as you turned these large installations on and then never turned them off, they would operate even more reliably than relays. It was the switching on and switching off that brought about the friability. So Flowers was able to use valves just ad lib. He said once he simply didn't care how many valves he used. He knew there was absolutely no obstacle to using valves in large numbers. He told me that at the outbreak of war, he was probably the only person in Britain who knew that electronic valves could be used on a large scale for high-speed computing. And so when he was summoned to Bletchley Park, ironically, not because of his knowledge of valves at all, but because of his knowledge of relays, but when he got there, he turned out to be the right man in the right place at the right time. Whoops. He was called in, at Turing's suggestion, in fact, to help with the design of the logic unit of the Robinson. And the design of the Robinson had been frozen by the time Flowers became involved. As soon as Flowers saw the design of the Robinson, he hated it. It had only got a couple of dozen valves, the rest was relays. He could see that it was never going to give the code breakers the speed and the reliability that they needed. So Flowers made a counter-proposal to Newman. He said, I can build you an all-electronic machine consisting of about 2,000 valves. It will be far more successful than the Robinson machine could ever be. Newman took advice and he heard the standard story. 2,000 valves, never work reliable, this man's an idiot. So Newman was unable to take up Flowers on his offer. Newman gave Flowers a certain amount of encouragement. He said to Flowers, look, if you think you can do it, you build it. But Flowers was left without the support of Bletchley Park. And he just quietly went back to his own laboratory in London and got on with building the all-electronic machine that he knew the code breakers needed. He took 10 months to build the first large-scale electronic computer, the first Colossus. Flowers said that he and his team worked until their eyes dropped out, night and day, in order to get Colossus finished. And then one day, early in 1944, some of Flowers' lads turned up at Bletchley Park with the first large-scale electronic computer on the back of a lorry. And here it is, Flowers' Colossus. The name Colossus was certainly apt. It was as big as a room and it weighed about a ton. You can see the message tape here over on the right, similar to the message tape in the Robinson. Flowers' machine caused quite a stir when it arrived at Bletchley Park. The code breakers simply couldn't believe the speed of the machine, and they were also very surprised to find, according to the wartime accounts, that when Colossus was set the same problem twice, it would produce the same answer twice. So you can infer that the Robinson did not always do this. So D-Day, of course, June 1944, the first Colossus and also Turing's bombs had been giving the Allies an unparalleled window on the Germans' preparations for the invasion. They knew the locations of every German division, thanks to Turing and Tutt, fundamentally. And then by the end of the war, there were 10 colossi in operation in Newman's unit at Bletchley Park, which was called simply the Newmanry. These machines were housed in 2 vast steel-framed buildings, and they worked around the clock. 10 enormous computers working around the clock. It was the world's first electronic computing facility, and it had things that we associate with the 60s and 70s rather than the 1940s. Job queues, teams of operators working in shifts, specialized tape punching crews, engineers always on hand to keep the machinery running smoothly. It wasn't really until the 1960s that anything like this was seen again, when the first modern large-scale computing centers started to come into existence. But although Flowers had built Colossus, nobody told the historians. Colossus was, of course, kept under the closest wraps until the 1990s, really. Some photographs were released in the 1970s, but it was the 1990s before any details came out. Sorry?
We had a conference in 1976.
Where Brian Randall wrote his famous paper, yes.
Flowers was there.
Flowers was there, yes. Yeah. But very little information about how Colossus worked was released at that time. And Flowers wrote
I can't resist telling you. During Flowers' talk, he wrote the truth table of the XOR function on the board. Another man got up quickly and erased it.
Not to try and cap your story, but Peter Hilton, one of the tunny breakers at Bletchley Park, he told me that he was sent a letter by GCHQ forbidding him to tell people that the wheels of the tunny machine were called chi wheels and psi wheels. So they were very, capricious about the parts of the information that they would release and the parts of the information that they wouldn't release. At that Los Alamos conference, the mere skeleton emerged, but all the details really were still hidden. And Flowers wrote up the talk that he gave at Los Alamos and published it in the Annals of the History of Computing. It came out in the early 80s. If any of you have looked at it, it's completely incomprehensible because Flowers was never allowed to say what Colossus did. And it wasn't until the declassifications in the late 1990s, and then most particularly in 2000, when General Report on Tunny was finally released, that the world was able to see exactly what Colossus had done and exactly how Tunny had worked and exactly what a contribution had been made to the war by these various characters that I've been talking about. Why did they hold on to the documents for so long? Very good question.
Computing.
Yes and no. Yes and no. Let me pick up the story with the ENIAC. If you look at practice, if you go to the library, and I'm not quite sure what time I'll stop, but I'm just going to keep on talking until someone stands up and tells me to stop. Sorry?
You can keep going until 8 a.m. tomorrow morning.
All right, that's what I'll do. If you go to the library and haul practically any book on the history of computing off the shelves, particularly ones from maybe 10 years ago and further back, you'll find it saying, I'm sure, that the first electronic computer was the ENIAC. And if you look at any computer science text that contains a few pages about the history of the subject, you will read that Eckert and Macaulay built the first large-scale electronic computer at the Moore School in Philadelphia. It was called the ENIAC, and it first ran in December 1946. A full 2 years after the first Colossus ran, but that isn't mentioned in the standard histories. The ENIAC was in some ways very similar to Colossus. It was a special purpose machine. It was dedicated to a particular task. They did eventually figure out how to turn it into a rather more general purpose machine, but it was originally designed by Eckert and Macaulay as a special purpose machine for calculating gunnery tables. And like Colossus, it didn't incorporate Turing's stored program concept. In order to set the ENIAC up for a new job, the operators needed to monkey around with cables and switches. They needed to literally rewire the machine, rerouting cables and throwing switches. It could take a day to reprogram the machine. If things went badly, it could take as long as a week to change ENIAC's program. It was a nightmare. It sounds just so primitive from a modern perspective, where we simply take Turing's stored program world for granted. But in those days, nobody had yet built a stored program machine. Flowers was quite bitter towards the end of his life about the fact that the ENIAC had got all the glory and his work was unknown. And it was, of course, the crippling secrecy that the British, for whatever reasons, imposed on Colossus that resulted for Flowers being written out of the history of computing for all those decades. Flowers said, "When after the war ended, I was told that the secret of Colossus was to be kept indefinitely. I was naturally disappointed. I was in no doubt, once it was a proven success, that Colossus was an historic breakthrough and that publication would have made my name in scientific and engineering circles. A conviction confirmed by the reception accorded to ENIAC, the US equivalent made public just after the war ended. I had to endure all the acclaim given to that enterprise without being able to disclose that I had anticipated it." It's one of the saddest stories, I think, in the history of computing. I mean, there is plenty of credit to go around, and it's a shame that not enough of it went Flowers' way. Nothing. Nothing. There was no need for him to know. He talked to Turing, but Turing would never. Turing was very security conscious. Turing would never have told someone about Colossus unless he had been cleared by the Bletchley Park authorities to say. And even after the war, when they were not allowed to talk about it. I can't imagine Turing ever telling von Neumann about Colossus. He might have talked generally about, you know, high-speed computing with thousands of valves, but to talk about Colossus, Tunny, exactly what they'd done, no. Very few people knew about Colossus in the years after the war.
Couldn't von Neumann guess some of that and just trigger?
I would think von Neumann could probably guess almost anything in the universe and get it
So it
right.
doesn't only take one bit to confirm, so he would have asked him the right question.
It's possible, yeah.
So I don't know what Colossus did, but I had the feeling that it wouldn't multiply or that it was more based on code breaking type of operation.
Yeah, Flowers gave the code breakers exactly what they needed to do the job in hand. You know, resources were short, time was short. He didn't even include the stored program concept. He knew about it, and Newman gave him Turing's 1936 paper to read while Flowers was designing Colossus. But the pressures were so great that he just couldn't consider trying to solve that technical problem. So he didn't even give them multiplication, let alone, as you say, differential equations. But of course, immediately after the war, if instead of breaking up 8 of the colossi and taking the other 2 off in secrecy to GCHQ, the new headquarters in London, if instead of doing that, Colossus had been made public, turned over to public science, then Turing, Newman, Flowers would very quickly have had the colossi solving differential equations, running stored programs, and there would have been this massive high-speed electronic computing facility in existence in the middle of 1945. Publicly known, clones of it would quickly have sprung up around the globe. Who knows what would have happened? Maybe the internet much earlier than it actually happened. Social networking, decades earlier perhaps, and all the social consequences that would have flowed from that. It's boggling to imagine.
Why didn't Flowers, like Eckler and Markley, set up a commercial company to make the thing after the war?
It was secret. He might have.
But the Acme and Markley thing was also secret. I mean, you say, the war is over. I'm going to do something completely different.
Well, I'm going to exploit the technology that I designed during the war.
Nothing to do with that. I'm just going to make a computer.
Well, I mean, he was, he had hardline security chiefs telling him that he was not to use any of the stuff, was not to mention any of it.
This is new.
Well, maybe if Flowers had been a bit more hard-nosed, things would have gone differently. Yeah. But also, Flowers was never, although he built the first large-scale electronic computer, computing was not at the forefront of his interest. He was a telephone engineer. What he longed to do was to build electronic telephone exchanges, get rid of all those nasty slow relays, and replace it with digital electronic equipment. And so that's what he devoted his life to. And he was successful. He was a major player in the first European electronic exchange at Highgate. But even there are sad stories. Because Flowers couldn't tell his colleagues in the post office what he'd done during the war, they tended to take no notice of him. And he told me once that he got a reputation for precociousness because he'd always be saying, do it this way, do it that way. And they would think, who is this guy? What does he know? Whereas if, even some aspects of his work had been disclosed earlier, his career would have gone quite differently. And presumably they could have done that much. They could have done enough to have enabled Flowers to build a computer had he wanted to have risen to the highest levels of the British Post Office had he wanted to, and they could have eased his way to building the first all-electronic telephone exchange by releasing information that did no damage at all to the core stuff that they wanted to keep secret. But they chose not to.
Even the fact that ENIAC was shortly after the war. What's your explanation for why the British government kept this secret for so
They
long?
were still using it. It's simple. GCHQ does not disclose, machinery that it is relying on. The Tunny machines were captured by the Russians as they moved across Europe, and the language changed from German to Russian, but the messages still flowed, and GCHQ were breaking them using 2 colossi. They destroyed 8 and another one in Flowers' factory because that was far too much capacity, but they thought 2 would be enough. And they soon combined, they built a new machine that combined Colossus and Robinson. They called it the Colorob. There were features of Robinson that were kind of more flexible than Colossus. And so they took the best of Colossus and the best of Robinson, and they built their Colorobs, which they used until general purpose stored program machines were available.
Rotor machines have been used for cryptography until 1990.
Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the East German Stasi were using Enigma until, I don't know, well into the 60s. The Washington bombs were kept in mothballs for a long time, and they were brought out and readied for use in the 1950s. Don't quite know why, but there was something going on.
Patch cables like the ENIAC?
Yes,
did?
switches and cables.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, time's running out. Could you finish your story without
All right.
these questions?
All right.
Tell these guys to shut up.
Let me tell you what happened after the war. Flowers' ideas lived on via Turing and Newman. Although the rest of the world didn't know about Colossus, they did. And Flowers has said that as soon as Turing and Newman saw his racks of electronic equipment, they realized that this was the way to build a universal Turing machine in hardware, a stored program computer. So immediately after the war, Newman went to the University of Manchester, where he became chair of mathematics, and he lost no time in setting up his computing machine laboratory. And Turing, in the meanwhile, went to London, where he was hired by the National Physical Laboratory in order to build an electronic stored program computer. So a kind of race developed between Newman in Manchester and Turing in London. This is Bushy House, part of the campus of the National Physical Laboratory. This is where Turing worked, designing his automatic computing engine, as it was called. The name was kind of a homage to Charles Babbage with his difference engine and his analytical engine. Turing's stored program computer was called the automatic computing engine, and a pilot model of the automatic computing engine first ran in Bushy House, in what was previously the butler's pantry, when this was a, upstairs, downstairs kind of establishment in Victorian times. Turing's ideas for the automatic computing engine caught the attention of the British press and the British public. The US model mentioned here is, of course, the ENIAC. And the journalist was quite right to mention that the ACE had a vastly bigger memory than the ENIAC. But the article misses out the most important difference, namely that the ACE was designed to be a stored program computer, whereas the ENIAC wasn't. They did manage to get it to run in a kind of read-only stored program mode in a very kludgy kind of way a few years later, but it was never designed as a stored program machine. Sadly, though, Turing lost the race. I think it would have been entirely appropriate historically if the ACE had been the first stored program computer to run, but it wasn't. Newman had the edge. Newman was fortunate in hiring these two extraordinary engineers, Tom Kilburn, Freddie Williams. They'd worked in radar during the war, and they were able to get the first stored program computer working in Manchester in 1948, June 1948, it ran its first program. It was a machine that owed a lot to Alan Turing. Williams was completely frank that he and Kilburn as he put it, didn't know the first thing about computers when they first entered the field in 1946. And Kilburn learned how to build a computer through attending a series of lectures that Turing gave in London in 1946 and 1947, lectures on the ACE. So Turing made two fundamental contributions to the Manchester computer. The basic idea was his, the idea of a stored program universal machine, and he also taught Kilburn the essentials of computer architecture. Turing went to Manchester as soon as they got the Manchester baby, as they called it, working. Turing couldn't wait to get his hands on a universal Turing machine in hardware. He fled from the National Physical Laboratory, leaving his project behind him, left his colleagues to build the pilot model of the automatic computing engine, and here it is. It first ran in 1950. It was what they built, what the engineers built, was only a shadow of the machine that Turing had originally envisaged in 1945. This machine had only 5% of the memory that Turing had specified in 1945. But they stayed with Turing's clock speed, 1 megahertz. And so the Pilot Ace, although it was physically quite a lot smaller than some of the other pioneering computers, it was able to blow every single one of them off the stage because it was so fast, thanks to Turing's foresight and his confidence that 1 megahertz engineering was possible. Many didn't believe that that could be done at that time. You can see that there's really not much equipment in Turing's machine, not much hardware. If you've seen photographs of some of the other early machines, the Pilot Ace is quite a lean machine by comparison. This is in accordance with Turing's design philosophy, which was to minimize hardware in favor of software. After all, he'd been writing computer programs since 1936. As far as he was concerned, programming was pretty much solved. He knew that was the easy part of the equation. It was the engineering problems that were hard. And so keeping the hardware to a minimum and throwing the burden onto the software was the obvious thing to do as far as Turing was concerned. So while other people were trying to build hardware multipliers and additional hardware to do floating point arithmetic, Turing did all that by programming. We know what Turing's view is of people who didn't subscribe to his design philosophy from a memo that he wrote around the end of 1946. He said, "I've read Wilkes's proposal for a pilot machine." Wilkes was a Cambridge engineer who was building a machine that followed the Eckert-Mauchly von Neumann EDVAC principles, EDVAC being the successor machine to the ENIAC in Philadelphia. So Turing says the code, or the operating system as we would now call it, which he suggests is, however, very contrary to the line of development here and much more in the American tradition of solving one's difficulties by means of much equipment rather than thought. A wonderfully acid comment by Turing. So here is the Deuce, the engineered, commercially marketed version of the Pilot Model Ace. It was one of the major workhorses of the early decades of the computer age. There were many Deuces in operation, and they didn't, I think the last one went out of service in the 1970s. So this is another machine spawned by the ACE design. This is the Bendix G15, designed by the American engineer Harry Huskey and built by the Bendix Corporation in Detroit. It's the first personal computer. Somewhat larger than the personal computers that we're used to nowadays. The Bendix was about the size of a large domestic refrigerator, but nevertheless it was a single-user machine. Huskey worked with Turing at the National Physical Laboratory for a year in 1947. And when he came back here, he applied Turing's design philosophy, minimizing hardware, throwing the load onto software, in order to design a machine that was small enough and cheap enough to be marketed as a single-user machine. So the idea was that engineers would have a Bendix G15 for their sole use parked by their desk. And thanks to Turing's timing tricks, Husky was able to make the Bendix as fast as mainframe machines, many times its size. So that's pretty much the end of the story. I find it very satisfying that there is this direct line of development from the Universal Turing Machine of 1936 through Flowers' Colossus to the first stored program computer at Manchester in 1948, and then on to the Deuce, which was one, as I say, was one of the major workhorses of the first years of the information age. And then the line extends on to the first personal computer. I think that's not a bad little bundle of machines to have flowed from Turing's work in 1936. And of course, he gave us the stored program world. Thank you. I'm happy to carry on answering questions if anyone wants to ask. Go ahead.
Can you talk about why the Challenging Turing Conference that is supposed to be held at Stanford isn't going to happen, and what the computer science department had to do with that?
Well, I don't have any personal knowledge of that.
But you do.
Maybe
I do.
someone else does.
Yeah.
Would you like to tell us about that?
This is my wife, by the way.
Hello.
Agent provocateur. Yeah, well, I'd say on Stanford campus, the role of Alan Turing in computer science hasn't been very well appreciated. The computer science department here is much more interested in computer engineering than it is in the foundational questions that Alan Turing addressed. So that would be my explanation at this point.
What about the website they can look at to
The whole story is on challengingturing.org.
You're a great agent provocateur. Sorry, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention something that is important to me, that I think is significant, but is very little known, is that at Manchester, Turing wrote a several hundred-page manual on how to use the Manchester computer, the Mark, whatever it was, and that manual is you know, it talks a lot about fundamental programming techniques, algorithms, and shows him to be a well-rounded computer scientist, even more. I mean, just this. Mike Woodger sent me a copy of this manual about 30 years ago. I tried to find. I was in Manchester last year and tried to, because I wanted to check something for a lecture I was going to give. Nobody there could find it.
Yeah, they keep it hidden away. It's on the web though now.
So what?
It's on the web.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah.
www.alanturing.net.
But I imagine that that everybody who thinks about Turing thinks about 1936 paper and knows nothing about how he would, you know, say you can debug programs by listening to the speaker that attached to the computer.
Yes.
It's like this.
Yes. Well, that was really Turing's third contribution to the Manchester computer. You know, the basic idea. Then he taught the engineers how to build it, and then he went up there and got the machine working for them. Before he arrived, programming was done by hand. They had a row of switches, and they had to enter the program digit by digit into memory. An output. The only output facility was there was a TV screen with dots on it, and you had to read the output off the screen in that way. It was Turing who turned it into a working machine. He provided them with input and output, and he used the technology that he'd been involved with at Bletchley Tape. He used punch tape, at Bletchley Park. He used punch tape technology, and he built them a tape reader for input. And various output facilities. So the Manchester computer is indebted on all sides to Turing. Although up in Manchester they try and sideline Turing. And it's heartbreaking to hear that they have hidden away his programming manual and won't show it to visitors such as yourself. Yes?
Documentation is really fascinating. I mean, I think the importance of documentation is sort of unappreciated in the computer science world, and significant documentation like Turing's Manchester Manual or Smalltalk 80 Manual, or just great documentation is really hugely influential, more so than people imagine. So I had a question. Your story sort of ended. What did Turing actually do at Manchester, and how did he finish his career?
Well, he wrote the first artificial intelligence program, which was a chess-playing program called TuroChamp. He wrote it with David Champernowne, a mathematical economist he was friendly with. They never managed to code TuroChamp for the machine. They had the program written, and they could hand work it. It played games. It beat human players. Turing wanted to code it for the Manchester machine, but he and Kilburn never got on. Kilburn had built the machine. You know, the machine was Turing's idea, and you know, Turing must have thought of it as his baby. And he, in one place, you can get a feeling for what his attitude to Kilburn and perhaps also Williams might have been from a phrase that he uses, not in connection with them in particular, but he talks about the mechanics who built the machine. So Kilburn was just the mechanic, but Kilburn had actually wired the thing together with the sweat of his own brow. As far as he was concerned, it was his machine. And there was this guy Turing who, you know, arrived late in the piece from London, from a, you know, what Kilburn would have seen as a failed project down there. Kilburn knew nothing about what Turing had done. Kilburn would never have read Turing's 1936 paper. He didn't know that all these ideas were Turing's. He knew that he'd been to Turing's lectures and had learnt computer architecture from Turing, but he tried to, you know, hush that up in later life. He didn't like admitting any indebtedness to Turing. And if you asked him, well, you know, how did you, learn how to build a computer back then in, 1946, 1947, he would say, well, I don't know, somehow at that time I just knew how to build a computer. But actually, it's no mystery how he found out. Turing told him. But anyway, there was this considerable hostility between the two of them. Kilburn just didn't know how to handle a man like Turing. And Turing... Sorry?
Probably vice versa.
Vice versa too, yes. And anyway, Kilburn prevented... He restricted Turing's access to the machine. He didn't want Turing using it particularly. And he forbade Turing from implementing his chess-playing program. I could almost hear Kilburn saying, what is this nonsense? We don't want people writing chess programs on my precious computer. He never was particularly favorably disposed to artificial intelligence, even in later life.
Program ever implemented?
I think it's been revived. I don't think it ever ran on a machine at the time.
Manuscripts survive?
Sorry?
Manuscripts of it survive, the source code?
No, I think not. But Turing's, no, the details of the TuroChamp program don't survive. All that exists is a note written much later by Champernowne, and he describes a bit about the program, but really he leaves too vague. But Turing wrote a paper on chess programming, really the pioneering paper on chess programming, although it was published without Turing's name on it, and so it's rarely associated with him. But there is much detail in there about how the successor version of the TuroChamp worked. And there's plenty of enough stuff there to be able to recreate Turing's program. Yes?
Turing's universal machine is very similar to Gödel's definition of inference in terms of arithmetic, in terms of its conceptual apparatus. And I wonder if Turing ever met Gödel at Princeton and if they interacted. Because in his famous paper, in which he introduces the Turing machine, he has this little sentence in there saying, "Of course, what I'm doing here is quite different than what's been done by Professor Gödel before me."
Yes, yes. Well, Turing certainly knew something about Gödel.
He references.
Yes.
Right.
Well, but before that, he attended Newman's lectures on the foundations of maths. And although the lecture notes for the year that Turing attended have been lost, the lecture notes for the preceding year have survived. So, you know, academic life being what it is, presumably the course was pretty much the same for the following year. And the course ends with an exposition of Gödel's incompleteness results. And there's, you know, a lot of stuff about Hilbert and the Entscheidungs problem and so on as well. I have seen a letter by Richard Braithwaite, who was a fellow at King's, who at high table at dinner one night managed to get Turing talking about what he was working on in 1935. And Braithwaite kind of said, I can see interesting connections with what Gödel over in Vienna has proved. He didn't get a very good response from Turing. Turing didn't really want to know about Gödel's work. You know, he liked working alone, he liked inventing everything for himself. I think it's quite possible he didn't pay too much attention to Gödel's work. But of course, Gödel was quite the reverse. You know, he was very interested in what other people were doing. He read Turing's 1936 paper, and there are many very complimentary quotes about Turing scattered through Gödel's work. And it was Turing's 1936 paper really that enabled Gödel to generalize the incompleteness result beyond Principia Mathematica to, you know, formal systems in general containing a bit of arithmetic. Yes?
By describing how few photographs of Turing survive, are there any extant video images like home movies or audio recordings?
No, there were audio recordings. Turing made a number of radio broadcasts with the BBC, but unfortunately the BBC threw away the tapes. I'd like to line them up and shoot them myself. The one hope is that some Commonwealth country that would have been receiving material from London has archived the tapes. And over the years, I've written to a few likely candidates, but I've never managed to get anywhere. But I still hope that there might be something. But no, certainly no video. And as far as we know, no voice.
What's his name? Tom Babbage's son's up in Australia.
Yes, yes.
Besides Harry Husky, who's still alive in your talk?
Oh, well, probably not many people. Harry, yes. I can't think of anyone else that I mentioned who's still alive. Sorry?
They may have some information still. They're mentally still active.
Who is this?
People you mentioned that's still alive.
Well,
they may know something.
Harry, I think.
Yes, Harry Husky
Harry.
knows a considerable amount. There are a few of the Bletchley Park people who are still alive. Jerry Roberts, for example, who worked with Turing, who's still sharp as a razor and full of energy. And will be, here's a plug, and Jerry Roberts will be giving the annual Turing lecture, the King's College Turing lecture, at Alan Turing's 100th birthday party at King's College, Cambridge, which I'm organising, and it will be on the 16th of June, just a few days before Turing's 100th birthday. 2 days, many star speakers, including... sorry?
Can you put the video up on the web?
Yes, but if you fancy coming to King's College for Turing's 100th birthday party, you'll be very welcome. We've got Turing's 3 nieces coming to talk about Turing. And also Turing's nephew will be talking about his memories of Turing, and a number of pioneers of computing and various interesting characters. Yes?
Was Flowers alive in the 90s when the Colossus was declassified?
Yes. Flowers died, I think he died in 1997, or was it the beginning of 98? Yeah, so he knew something about it. He missed the declassification of the Tunney report, but I'd managed to get hold of a kind of a bootleg copy which I gave him, so he had seen it. And he wrote a couple of chapters for the book that I subsequently brought out on Colossus. But although he devoted great energy and enthusiasm to those chapters, his whole attitude was, it's too late. You know, if this had been 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it could have made a difference to me. And you know, he had a quiet pride in what he'd done, and he was glad that the story was just about to break, but he knew it was too late for him.
I seem to remember at the Los Alamos conference, he was quite a jolly person and very upbeat at that time.
Yes, I remember him as jolly, full of stories. Yeah, very modest.
Had to be faster than the mechanical one, but not how much? I mean, were they anywhere near comparable?
Well, there were various different types of electronic bomb. The cheap and dirty version had an electronic attachment. They called it the Cobra because of the great snake of wires that went from the basic Turing bomb to the electronic attachment that just looked at the fourth wheel. But Desch's bombs were much more integrated devices. As to the comparative speeds, I don't have the figures at my fingertips.
If there are no other questions, then I'd like one more time to thank Jack. And
thank you all very much.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.